For 2 centuries, Beethoven's family tree seemed like one of the most thoroughly documented in European history. Parish records, baptismal certificates, 7 generations of Van Beethovens mapped across Flanders and the Rhineland, every birth, every marriage, every death carefully entered into the ledgers of towns stretching from Belgium to Bonn. The genealogy was settled, or so everyone believed. Then, in 2023, a team of geneticists extracted DNA from locks of the composer's hair, and the story his genes told contradicted the story in those records. The man who composed the Ninth Symphony, who shaped Western music more profoundly than almost anyone who ever lived, may not have been a Beethoven at all. Not biologically. The evidence points to a secret buried somewhere in 7 generations of his father's line, and the real question is not just who, but how an entire field missed it for so long. To understand why this mattered, you need to understand how confident historians were. The Beethoven family is traceable back to Art van Beethoven, born in 1535 in a Flemish village. The surname itself means from Betenhoven, a small settlement in what is now Belgium. From Art, the line runs forward through his son Hendrik, born around 1572 in Kampenhout, through generation after generation, each one recorded in the municipal archives of towns that kept meticulous parish records. By the time Ludwig van Beethoven was born in 1770 in Bonn, the family had moved from Flanders into Germany, but the paper trail remained intact. Ludwig's grandfather, also named Lodewijk, was a respected musician, a chapel master at the court of the Elector of Cologne. His father Johann was a tenor singer and court musician, a man who recognized his son's extraordinary talent early and, by most accounts, pushed him relentlessly. The family was entrenched in the musical establishment of Bonn, well-known, well-connected, well-documented. And then there was the hair. In Beethoven's day, it was common to collect locks of hair from the famous or beloved. When the composer lay dying in March of 1827, jaundiced and swollen, friends came to say goodbye, and several asked for a lock of his hair. One of them, the 15-year-old musician Ferdinand Hiller, is said to have clipped a strand from Beethoven's head the day after his death. That lock, the so-called Hiller lock, passed through generations until it surfaced at Sotheby's in London in 1994, where 4 members of the American Beethoven Society purchased it for $7,300. The Hiller lock became the foundation for decades of scientific investigation. Researchers at Argonne National Laboratory in Illinois tested it and found lead levels up to 100 times the normal amount. A 2007 paper suggested lead poisoning had contributed to Beethoven's deafness, perhaps even his death. Books were written. A documentary was filmed. The lead poisoning narrative became part of the Beethoven mythology. And all of it, every conclusion, rested on a single assumption, that the hair actually belonged to Beethoven. No one thought to question it. The provenance was documented. The frame looked right for the early 19th century. The story of young Hiller snipping the lock was well known. But provenance is not proof, and documentation is not DNA. The tools to check simply did not exist. Not in 1994. Not in 2007. The field accepted the chain of custody because there was no way to verify the biology. That gap between what records said and what science could confirm would persist for decades. It wasn't negligence. It was a limitation of the era. Before ancient DNA techniques advanced enough to extract genetic material from rootless hair, there was no test to run. Hair without follicles yields only fragmented, degraded DNA, short sequences that must be painstakingly reconstructed. The technology that would finally close this gap was still being developed. In 2014, a young master's student at the University of Tübingen in Germany realized that science had finally caught up. Tristan Begg, studying archaeology and biological anthropology, had volunteered at the Ira F. Brilliant Center for Beethoven Studies at San Jose State University, where he met the center's director, William Meredith. Meredith had been involved in Beethoven hair research since that Sotheby's auction 20 years earlier. The two of them saw the same opportunity, that new, ancient DNA methods might finally allow whole genome sequencing from small quantities of historical hair. Before we see what their research uncovered, if you're finding this investigation as compelling as we did, subscribe so you don't miss future stories where science rewrites what we thought we knew. The project took years. Between 2015 and 2020, BEG performed authentication testing on 8 independently sourced locks of hair attributed to Beethoven, collected from public and private collections across the United Kingdom, continental Europe, and the United States. Each sample arrived sealed, catalogued, carrying the weight of expectation. In the lab, chemical baths stripped away 2 centuries of contamination, oils from the hands that had treasured these relics, environmental residue from display cases and lockets. What remained, if anything survived, were fragments of genetic code, short and degraded, readable only by machines sensitive enough to detect a whisper buried in noise. Sequencing machines read the surviving fragments. Software stitched them together, base pair by base pair. 5 of the 8 locks yielded DNA from the same male individual. Damage patterns in the DNA were consistent with origins in the early 19th century. 2 of the 5 came with unbroken chains of provenance stretching back to the 1820s. One of them, Beethoven had hand-delivered himself to the pianist Anton Halm in April of 1826, declaring, "That is my hair." The researchers deemed these 5 samples almost certainly authentic. The best preserved, the Stumpf lock, yielded a genome sequenced to 24-fold coverage, an extraordinary depth for historical DNA. When they mapped its autosomal ancestry, the results clustered with people living in present-day North Rhine-Westphalia. That fit perfectly with Beethoven's documented German roots. Everything checked out. But 2 of the locks did not belong to Beethoven, and one of them was the Hiller lock. The DNA from the Hiller lock came from a woman. Not just any woman, someone with genetics highly prevalent among Ashkenazi Jewish populations. The most famous lock of Beethoven's hair, the one sold at Sotheby's, studied at Argonne, cited in books and documentaries, had never been his. Every conclusion drawn from it, the lead levels, the poisoning theory, the speculations about opiates and mercury, none of it applied to the composer. 2 decades of research collapsed by a single genetic test. William Meredith, who had been part of the earlier scientific work, speculated that the authentic hair may have been destroyed at some point and replaced with strands from Sophie Lyon, the wife of Ferdinand Hiller's son Paul. She was Jewish. The switch, if it happened, was invisible to anyone examining the lock with 19th or 20th century tools. Only DNA could detect it. But the Ancestry surprise was just beginning. The researchers turned to the Y-chromosome. In human genetics, the Y-chromosome passes from father to son with very few changes each generation, making it a powerful tool for tracing paternal lineage across centuries. If Beethoven's genealogy was accurate, his Y-chromosome should closely match that of other men descended from Ludwig van Beethoven through the male line. Martin Larmousseau, a genetic genealogist at KU Leuven in Belgium, located 5 living men who share the surname van Beethoven and whose genealogy traces back to art through documented paternal descent. Saliva samples were collected. The Y chromosomes were sequenced. All 5 men matched each other. Their haplogroup was R1b, specifically RFT446200, within the broader R1b lineage. Their DNA was consistent, their genealogical records were consistent, their surname was consistent, everything held together. Then the team compared these results to Beethoven's hair, and the match they expected did not exist. His Y chromosome belonged to haplogroup I1, not R1b, not even close. These 2 lineages diverged over 45,000 years ago, roughly around the time modern humans were leaving Africa. This was not a minor discrepancy, not a mutation accumulated over a few generations. This was a completely different paternal line. The evidence showed a specific, measurable reality. Ludwig van Beethoven's Y-chromosome did not match the Y-chromosome of verified descendants of his documented ancestor. The divergence was not statistical noise, it was absolute. This ruled out the simplest explanations. It was not a record-keeping error. Belgian genealogical records from this period are considered exceptionally reliable, and the strong correspondence between the surname and Y chromosome among the 5 living Beethovens confirmed the accuracy of the documented lineage. It was not contamination. 5 independent hair locks all carried the same haplogroup. It was not ambiguous. 2 haplogroups separated by 45 millennia do not converge by accident. What it implied was an extra-pair paternity event. Somewhere between the conception of Hendrik van Beethoven in Kampenhout around 1572 and the conception of Ludwig in 1770, a woman in the Beethoven line bore a child fathered by someone other than her husband. That child was raised as a Beethoven, carried the name, inherited the family's position. But biologically, the paternal line was severed. 7 generations. Any one of them could hold the break. The researchers could not pinpoint exactly where it occurred, but one generation stands out as circumstantially suspicious. Ludwig's grandmother, Maria Ball, suffered from alcoholism and was treated at a local monastery. Her son, Johann, Ludwig's father, has no surviving baptismal record, unusual for a family embedded in the civic and musical establishment of Bonn. Some Beethoven biographers had already noted this gap, wondering privately whether Lodewijk Sr. was truly Johann's biological father. The DNA now gave that old speculation new weight. Not everyone in the field agrees on the implications. Some scholars caution against over-interpreting the circumstantial evidence around Maria Ball, arguing that missing baptismal records were not uncommon, particularly in eras of war, displacement, or simple clerical failure. Others point out that the extra-pair paternity could have occurred much earlier, perhaps in the generation of Hendrik himself, whose paternity from Art could not be definitively confirmed by the genetic data. The researchers found that Art fathered his sons Jan and Lambert, but the line connecting Art to Hendrik remains unproven genetically. Meanwhile, the health findings from the same study added new dimensions to the composer's biography. The genome revealed mutations in 2 genes, PNPLA3 and HFE, that roughly tripled Beethoven's genetic risk for progressive liver disease. His autopsy in 1827 had already documented severe cirrhosis, a shrunken, hardened liver that told a story of years of damage. Now genetics explained part of why. Traces of hepatitis B virus were recovered from the hair, a subgenotype common in Europe since at least the Middle Ages. And Beethoven's conversation books, which he used to communicate during his last decade of deafness, suggest regular alcohol consumption, moderate by Viennese standards of the era, but enough to interact dangerously with his genetic predisposition. Then, in 2024, a follow-up study led by Nader Rifai of Harvard Medical School tested the 2 most securely authenticated locks for heavy metals. The results: lead concentrations 64 and 95 times above normal levels, confirmed that Beethoven did have lead poisoning. But the levels, while severe, were not considered high enough to be the sole cause of death. They may have contributed to his gastrointestinal suffering and possibly his hearing loss. But the liver disease that killed him was driven by a convergence of genetics, virus, and alcohol. The lead finding was real. It just was not the whole story, and it had originally been attributed to the wrong hair. The cruelest irony is this. The primary goal of the entire project was to explain Beethoven's hearing loss, the very condition he begged the world to understand in his 1802 letter to his brothers. And the genome offered no clear genetic explanation, no monogenic cause, no definitive variant. The mystery that haunted him in life, that shaped his art, that isolated him from the world he filled with music, remains unsolved, even by the tools of the 21st century. Today, Beethoven's genome sits in a public database, available to any researcher. Family tree DNA's records hold his Y-chromosome profile, and new testers continue to join the database. Somewhere, a man alive right now may carry the Y-chromosome lineage that matches Beethoven's true biological paternal line. That match could eventually reveal which family, in which town, in which generation, a child was conceived who would carry a name that did not belong to him by blood, a name that would become synonymous with genius. If this hidden chapter of history intrigued you, subscribe to explore more stories where science reveals what the records left out. The most famous Beethoven was not, biologically, a Beethoven. His music defined an era. His name defined a dynasty. And his DNA quietly told a different story for 200 years, waiting for someone to ask the right question. If the break in his paternal line occurred at Johann's generation, does that mean the genetic inheritance that shaped one of history's greatest musical minds came from a lineage we have not yet identified?